Quote, "A motion was made by Mr. Cowan, desiring to know the mind of the meeting with respect to holding ministerial or Christian communion occasionally with those of the Episcopal or Independent persuasion, the meeting being of different opinions, put a vote. Hold communion with those of the Episcopal or Independent persuasion occasionally, upon supposition always that they are by profession visible saints, or not. And the roll being called, and votes marked, it carried, hold communion. And therefore the meeting find it agreeable to the principles of the Presbytery of Relief to hold communion occasionally with such," unquote. And here a footnote. Note carefully, the above show the occasional terms of communion with the Relief, but their stated terms as a church yet remain a secret from the world, and it is to be feared from a great part of themselves. From the above extract it plainly appears that the Relief, of all others of the Presbyterian name, plead most strenuously in favours of association with Malignants, in making it consistent with their principles to hold communion occasionally with Episcopalians and Independents, both of which are open and avowed enemies to the pure discipline and government which Christ has fixed, to continue unalterable in his church forever. And it is difficult to say how their being by profession visible saints is any warrant for a Presbyterian church to allow them communion while they are walking visibly contrary to God's holy law, by worshipping him in a sinful and superstitious way, the Relief themselves being judges. And here a footnote. See Hutcheson's dissertation, page 28. Sure it is that the Lord's own people, by the violence of temptation or strength of sin, may bring themselves under scandal, so that they cannot be admitted to church communion without sin, even although they be visible saints. And is not an open and continued violation of the second precept of God's law, neither confessed nor forsaken, a public scandal sufficient to warrant the church to withhold the seals of the covenant from any person until they be brought to a sight of this as their sin, and to turn from it, as well as a violation of the seventh, eighth, and ninth, unless we account sins against the first table of God's law less aggravated than sins against the second? But as this scheme is evidently against the law of God, and here a footnote, 1 Corinthians 1 verse 10, directly contrary to the nature of true Presbyterian principles, plainly contrary to our most solemn national engagements, here a footnote, Solemn League and Covenant, and has a native tendency to introduce confusion and disorder into the Church of God, it ought to be detested by all who really desire to see truth and holiness, who really desire to see truth and holiness, the foundation of peace and unity among the followers of Jesus. The opinions of our worthy reformers and the principles of the authors of the following declarations in favor of uniformity in the worship of God and against associations with all malignants whatever have in general been esteemed by all who favor the dust of Zion. And never did a more virulent enemy of the Presbyterian name take up the pen against them and their professed successors than a Mr. Patrick Hutcheson, a minister of the Relief, formerly at St. Ninian's, now at Paisley, who had spared no pains to blacken their characters and defame their work, as any person may see by reading his controversial pieces. In his dissertation of what he calls The Nature and Genius of the Kingdom of Christ, page 17, he represents our reformers as, quote, very ignorant of the scriptural conditions of church fellowship and the sacred right of private judgment, unquote. And indifferent parts of that publication he seems to view all, who favor the covenanted uniformity of the last century, as very unacquainted with the nature of the Messiah's kingdom. And after he has vented his spleen sufficiently against our reformers, the covenants, and the secession, he thinks proper, without any provocation, to give the Reformed Presbytery a stroke, as he goes along, that none who favor covenanted principles may pass with impunity. This is contained in the above-mentioned dissertation from pages 183 to page 188, and a few sketches more, page 211 and 212. The narrow limits of a preface would not admit of a long reply, neither would anything have been said on the subject in this place had not Mr. Hutcheson's reasoning against the Reformed Presbytery affected the whole substance of the following publication. And although Mr. Walker at Polkshaw's has obtained one of the most complete victories over this author that can well be supposed in the way of controversy, yet it was not to be expected that he was to vindicate the principles of the R.P., which are so different from his own, especially on the head of civil government. Mr. H. condescends on two things especially, in the principles and practices of the RP, which are exceedingly surprising to him. First, says he, quote, they disown our present excellent sovereign as the lawful king of Britain, and refuse to pay him obedience, even in things of a lawful nature, unquote. The RP and their connections have not been much accustomed to give flattering titles to princes, as none of these have been very active of late in prosecuting the great ends of their office and promoting the declarative glory to God, the interests of his church, and the real good of mankind, according to God's holy law. However, Mr. Hutcheson may be assured that they entertain no resentment against the person of the present occupant, nor any of the good qualities which he possesses. They sincerely wish that he were still more excellent than external royalty can make him, that he were adorned with the image of Christ, consisting in knowledge, righteousness, and true holiness, and with that grace which might bring him to see all the dishonors done to the royal prerogatives, precious truths, and holy religion of Jesus under the present constitution, and that he may be made to hate the whore, to make her desolate, and bear to eat her flesh, and burn her with fire, Revelation 17, verse 16, and that he may become a nursing father to the church of Christ. But they can by no means acknowledge him, nor any of the episcopal persuasion, to be a lawful king over these covenanted lands, and the reason for this part of their principles they have exhibited at large in their judicial testimony, Part 2, which the reader may consult at his leisure, and see if it be not there proven by clear and conclusive arguments that neither the British subjects nor any society of Christians have any natural, inherent, or essential right to choose and set up civil rulers directly contrary to the express precept of God's law, that are bound by their very constitution habitually to violate the authority of the great lawgiver. It would have been a favor if Mr. Hutcheson and some others who insist so much on obedience to civil rulers in things of a lawful nature had properly described what constitutes the commands of rulers lawful, and what is truly necessary to give a Christian magistrate a moral right to rule over a Christian people. Mr. Hutcheson seems at once to take it for granted that the consent of the majority of the community is all that is necessary to convey a moral right to issue commands and to claim obedience thereto. But this is entirely setting aside the law of God as a complete rule of life, and is either plainly denying the Scriptures to fix any particular qualifications for civil rulers, or otherwise allowing the majority of a community an inherent right to fill up a moral ordinance of God with such as are his open and declared enemies. He will scarcely be so barefaced as to do the former, while the following passages stand in the Bible. Thou shalt in any wise set him king over thee, whom the Lord thy God shall choose. One from among thy brethren shalt thou set king over thee. Thou mayest not set a stranger over thee, which is not thy brother. He that ruleth over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. Ought ye not to walk in the fear of God? Be wise, ye kings, be instructed, ye judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear. Kings shall be thy nursing fathers. Thou shalt suck the breasts of kings. Rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. He is the minister of God to thee for good. Deuteronomy 17:15, 2 Samuel 23:3, Nehemiah 5:9, Psalm 2 verses 10 and 11, Isaiah 49:23, and Isaiah 60 verse 16, Romans 13 verses 1 through 7, and Hosea 8 verse 4. And he surely would not be so impious as to grant the latter, as that would amount to an allowing of men a negative over God, or a liberty to break his law of pleasure in setting up kings, but not according to his precept, and princes, but not according to his approbation, which God himself finds fault with in his own people. Footnote, that taken from Hosea 8, verse 4. Now, would not Mr. Hutcheson account it religious tyranny indeed to oblige a society of men to yield obedience for conscience sake to such rulers as are bound by their solemn oath as a condition of their government to maintain and support false modes of worship directly contrary to the divine law, and are vested by a corrupt community for the glorious prerogatives of the Lord Jesus, to the sacrilegious robbery of Zion's king, and their being declared head over all persons and causes, civil and ecclesiastic, as to give their power to the man of sin, which, as God's vicegerents and deputies by office, they ought to employ against him for the glory of God, and grant a legal and authoritative toleration to open idolaters and corrupters of the worship of God, to trample his royal authority underfoot, and to violate his righteous law at pleasure by worshipping him contrary to his own appointment. And would he not reckon it exceedingly sinful in the minority of a society, who see the evil of these things in a constitution, to acknowledge the lawfulness of that constitution, or to follow the corrupt majority in this their evil deed? If he would prove by clear and conclusive arguments that such rulers as are bound by their very constitution to act in open rebellion against the Most High God, have yet a moral right in his sight to give commands, either lawful or unlawful, to a Christian reformed people who have framed their laws, both of constitution and administration, agreeable to the holy law of God, it would settle the controversy. But this he has not yet done, and in all probability never will do. And indeed, if he had considered more maturely why the RP cannot own the present civil government, he would have spared some of his satire and irony contained in page 183, where he says, quote, "From what are they, that is, the RP, reformed? From dutiful allegiance to our excellent sovereign, raised to the throne of Britain by the consent of the community? From what are they reformed? From obedience to the lawful commands of a prince bound upon them by the law of God and nature into open and avowed contempt of his authority? Excellent reformation indeed, and worthy of the venerable name." Unquote. Mr. Hutcheson might have known that the RP and their connections have uniformly testified against that apostate society which, at the Revolution, raised to the throne of Britain a supreme magistrate of the episcopal persuasion, invested him with an Erastian supremacy over the Church, contrary to our national attainments in the time of our Second Reformation. And they have all along viewed it their duty to refuse all allegiance to such magistrates while they continue in their stated opposition against Christ and his religious cause, however mild and gentle that they may otherwise be. If he would prove that a prince, bound by a solemn oath, in an essential condition of receiving his crown, to act contrary to God's law and maintaining inviolably a system of superstition, is yet bound upon us by the law of God and nature, the RP would yield a ready obedience to him in common with other subjects. But until that be done, they must be excused in obeying God rather than man. Isaiah 8, verse 12. And although they do not look upon themselves as reformed from obedience to all or any of the lawful commands of moral powers, constituted and qualified according to the moral law, yet they desire to be reformed from all the idolatries of popery and superstitions of prelacy and confusion of sectarians. They are reformed from holding church communion with Episcopalians, Independents, and all public enemies to the scriptural order of Christ's house, as well as with those who refuse the lawfulness of church and national covenanting under the New Testament, and deny the moral obligation of our solemn covenants against popery, prelacy, and false worship, who by this means use their utmost influence to harden these backsliding nations in their open apostasy from the righteous ways of God. A second group of Mr. Hutcheson's surprise in the principles of the RP is, quote, that they, in his view, suspend obedience to his present Britannic Majesty on a sinful condition. They would, says he in page 184, acknowledge the king's authority and obey his lawful commands were he to swear and espouse the solemn league and covenant, and solemnly engage to prosecute the ends of that religion's uniformity, in obliging all his subjects by the power of the sword to fall in with that league and profess the religious system established in it, however contrary to their own conviction. Unquote. But where did Mr. H. ever find it in the principles of the RP that they require the civil magistrate to compel men to profess any form of religion by the power of the sword? Cannot he promote the interest of true religion by his own virtuous example, by admitting good men to offices in the state, and withholding from bad men, and encouraging a pious and faithful ministry? And where would be the tyranny of God's public minister, appointed to be the keeper of both holy tables of his law, restraining false modes of worship, positively forbidden by the supreme lawgiver? Is it any tyranny for a master to oblige his servants, by his authority, to observe the Sabbath, and to restrain them from evil company and immoral actions thereon, to reward the more faithful, and to encourage them, by example and precept, to abstain from evil and to do good? May not a magistrate, as God's public deputy, who is favored with the true knowledge of the divine law, and set up by a nation which has adopted the profession of the true religion into its civil establishment, as Britain has done, suppress everything by his authority which is contrary to that establishment, and give his sanction only to what is agreeable thereto?